Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Pratik and I'll be taking up the news today discussion for 21st May. So we have five main news and we also have some quick updates which are relevant from prelims. In the main news, the first news is Joint Parliamentary Committee report on One Nation, One Election. The second news is World Cities Report 2026 released by UN Habitat. Third news is India-Italy strategic partnership now elevated to special strategic partnership. Fourth news, ease of doing research report released by Niti Aayog. And in the fifth news, USA and China agreed to build a constructive relationship of strategic stability. In the places in news, we have Republic of Korea or South Korea. So let us start with the very first news, that is One Nation, One Election. And this news has gained into prominence because recently Joint Parliamentary Committee has released a report and it has stated that by conducting One Nation, One Election or simultaneous election, the public exchequer will benefit around 7 lakh crore and it will increase the GDP growth by up to 1.6 percentage point. Now, this is a major claim as per the Joint Parliamentary Committee, okay? And therefore, it again validates the government position of conducting the simultaneous election. So in this context, we need to understand the idea behind the simultaneous election, why it is required, and what are the expert committees that have recommended this particular move. Then we should also understand some of the concerns with respect to One Nation, One Election. So these are the three areas that we will be covering. First, we will talk about the idea behind One Nation, One Election. We will talk about the various reasons why it should be conducted. And lastly, we'll talk about the challenges that it faces. So with respect to simultaneous election, we should understand the fact that democracy is based on the very simple idea that everyone should have decision-making power in the more of the way the country is being governed. And particularly this expression is given through voting. So election becomes a very major component of procedural and substantive democracy. But the problem is in election, the way it is being conducted, the sanctity of election sometimes determine the nature of democracy as well. That is why it is very important for some of the electoral reforms to take place. And simultaneous election is being held as one of the major electoral reforms by the government and some of the expert committees as well. So what exactly is simultaneous election? See, simultaneous election basically means that the elections of at the central level or at the union level, especially at the Lok Sabha, at the state legislative assemblies. So it doesn't include Rajya Sabha, by the way. It only includes Lok Sabha at the union level. Rajya Sabha is not added. Lok Sabha, state legislative assembly at the state level, and elections at the local level, such as for PRIs and ULBs. Their election or this election should be synchronized, basically, which means that they should have one format of election or one duration of the election should be synchronous. Now, why is this being held as one of the major electoral reform? See, the problem with elections in India is that more or less we are always in election mode. Somewhere in some state or the other state, there is always some election. For example, recently, election was held in West Bengal, in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Puducherry. So a lot of resources were wasted in terms of campaigning, in terms of conducting elections. So you require election machinery, right? So issues with respect to conducting several times election is that it is cost intensive. It creates a lot of cost because of the whole fact that you require election machinery. Second, it also impacts the administrative machinery, because the power of conducting election in India is given to Election Commission of India, but at the same time, it doesn't have its uh, own or independent group of individuals who it would be able to deploy. So what happens is during election time, several government officers are deployed or are put to Election Commission under deputation. So in a way, it creates some sort of vacuum. So for example, understand that teachers, government teachers are also employed for some election duties. So during that time, school education will suffer. Similarly, other officers are also involved in the election process. So it creates some sort of administrative vacuum. Apart from that, one of the major reason why government and other bodies have recommended simultaneous election is because of the imposition of model code of conduct. Now, what exactly is model code of conduct? A model code of conduct is a measure to provide level playing field to the government which is in power and the opposition party which is outside power. Now, if government being in power provide for it or announces some government schemes during the or near the time of election, or especially when the election schedule is announced, that may incline the voters to vote for the government. So to ensure that this move does not happen, model code of conduct is essentially imposed. And thereby, during this time, no new government scheme can be imposed, or the major administrative work is largely for at the level of maintenance. Okay, so because of this, it also leads to paralysis of administration, right? So because of this, these three reasons are given as the major reason behind or this one nation, one election. So these are the three reasons. First is to ensure financial savings and growth. So it will reduce cost of conducting election and streamline the time consuming process, and it will aid in economic growth. And this has been substantiated by the Joint Parliamentary Committee report, which said that the economic growth can be up to 1.6% growth can be further added. Plus the saving would be around 7 lakh crore. Then it will prevent policy paralysis, because frequent elections lead to repeated imposition of model code of conduct, which disrupts development activities. And thirdly, it also leads to resource preservation and sustained governance. It will minimize the frequent diversion of administrative machinery, such as the teachers and the security forces, such as the CAPF, which are often deployed at the poll level to ensure that booth capturing, etc., does not take place. So these are the reasons why a lot of experts have suggested simultaneous election. Now, let us take a look into some key experts who have suggested simultaneous elections. So here we have Law Commission of India in its 170th report, 255th report have provided for this, along with draft report of 2018. Second expert committee is Parliamentary Standing Committee report of 2015. Then working paper of Niti Aayog 2017, and high-level committee chaired by the former President Ram Nath Kovind in 2023. Now, this committee, the high-powered committee, has recommended a phase-wise implementation, which means that initially the election should be held for Lok Sabha and state assemblies together, and later after to the local bodies within 100 days after that. So initially the first phase would be combining the state assemblies with that of Lok Sabha, and later on the local bodies can be added. So this is about the expert committees which have suggested the idea of simultaneous elections. But we should also understand that there is a huge opposition towards simultaneous election as well. And largely, we can categorize them under two categories. One category is based on conceptual level or ideational level, and the other one is with respect to implementation. So one set of critique is with respect to the concept, with respect to the idea behind the simultaneous election, and the other one is with respect to the implementation challenges. So with respect to the idea behind simultaneous election, the first major criticism is that it will ensure that the accountability will be reduced. Okay, so this will lead to dilution of accountability of the political leaders, because during elections, the political parties can be held accountable. And elections at different stages give the political leaders some sort of insight into the mind of the electors or the voters, and thereby they can also change or do course correction. The second important ideational or conceptual uh, issues or criticism with respect to simultaneous election is the fact that when the elections are clubbed together, it will undermine or it will give more power or more emphasis to the national issues, and it will undermine the local matters. So, for example, we know that national matters include defense, security, employment, etc. Right? But at the state level, it is law and order. It could be about land, etc. At the local level, it could be about municipalities. It could be about basics, sanitation, etc. But when all these matters are clubbed together, there would be very few people who would be able to distinguish which tier of the government is responsible for what, and there could be a lot of issues that would prevent people to make a very wise judgment here. So conceptually or ideationally, these are the major challenges. For example, here we have mentioned that there is overshadowing of the local issue, which may lead to the nationalization of the local issues. And secondly, it will also lead to issues with the accountability part. Now, with respect to the implementational hurdles, first is that here there is a requirement for constitutional amendment, and constitutional amendment here specially required in terms of Article 83, because as of now, the Constitution has given the tenure of Lok Sabha as 5 years. Now, this is mentioned under Article 83. And correspondingly, this is also given under Article 172 for the state legislative assembly. Now, if this matter or if one nation, one election has to be implemented, then we need to change these articles. Now, this would be very difficult because it may account for the constitutional amendment under Article 368, which would require 2/3 vote present and voting plus half of the total strength. Along with that, some provision would also require amendment by half of the state legislature as well. So this would be a Herculean task, and therefore it requires a lot of negotiation, right? So this could be one challenge. The second challenge is that what if one of the state legislature gets dissolved, maybe because of president's rule or maybe because of some other reason. In such cases, till the time the next general election is to be held, for the period till which it is resolved, it continues to be, or it will have to be under president rule. Now, this will be very bad for that particular state. Okay, so these are some of the challenges that are being mentioned as part of the implementational challenges, along with the conceptual challenges, right? Apart from that, there are logistical deficit as well. So because it demands a massive infrastructure scale up, including an estimated 9,300 crore for additional EVMs, VVPATs, according to NITI Aayog. So these are some of the challenges that we can mention. Now, from this topic, UPSC has most recently asked this question: examine the need for electoral reforms as suggested by various committees with particular reference to one nation, one election. So here you have to talk about whole set of electoral reforms, not just about simultaneous election, but also you can talk about how to reduce criminalization of politics, how to ensure political accountability, how to induce inner party democracy, things like that, okay? And then especially you can talk about the idea behind one nation, one election, which committees have recommended it, what are some of the benefits of this, and what could be some of the potential challenges, right? So this would be the first topic. Let's now talk about the second news, that is World Cities Report 2026 released by UN Habitat. And this topic would be under GS Paper 1, Indian Society, especially the topic of urbanization, okay? And here the title of this report is Global Housing Crisis, Pathways to Action. It highlights some of the issues that are there with respect to owning houses, which are affordability constraint, pervasive informality, increasing climate-related risk as interlinked and mutually reinforcing challenges. So basically it has talked about what are the challenges that people face when it comes to the whole idea of urbanization and the kind of places that they dwell, right? So let's take a look into the key highlights first. So first is that there is a acute crisis of housing. So up to 3.4 billion people worldwide, they lack access to adequate housing. And homelessness rate for India here stand at 13 per 10,000 as per the Institute of Global Homelessness. So first thing is that there are several people, in approximately 40% of the world population do not have access to any housing. Okay, this is a huge number. Secondly, those who have houses, they are prone to climate related hazards, and it is projected to destroy 160 million homes by 2040. Maybe they are located near coast, or they are so much vulnerable, right? Housing alone is responsible for 17 to 21% of global total emission. And ineffective national housing policies, it failed to fully incorporate key dimensions of adequacy, affordability, tenure, security, accessibility, etc. So what it says is that not only people have lesser access to houses, there is homelessness. Then secondly, their homes are vulnerable to climate. And thirdly, even if they have access to home, there are problems of affordability. The income level is stagnating, but the rental costs are increasing. And fourthly, this is a very important data that they have mentioned, that average price to income ratios are increasing, which earlier used to be 9.5 and now it has grown to 11.7 globally. So what exactly it means? What is price to income ratio? So imagine if a house is for rupees 1 crore and your monthly or your annual income is 10 lakh rupees per month, per year. Now if you divide this price of house by your average annual income, then you get a ratio that is this. So basically this will give you a ratio of 10, okay, by this. So basically what it says is that till what time, based on the income that you have, how long it will take for you to afford a house, okay. Now this used to be 9.5 in 2010, but then it has increased to 11.7. In India's case, Mumbai has the highest P by E ratio, which means that in Mumbai, you require around 14.3 years on an average to afford, you have to work for 14.3 years on the salary that you have in order to afford a house on an average. And for Delhi, it is 10.1. And globally, the number is 11.7. Okay. Now, they have also talked about the reasons behind the what are driving this crisis, and primarily you can see the crisis is driven by a host of reasons. First is demographic drivers. There is increasing population which is in need of housing, because now we are having a very single household level. There is increasing urbanization, migration of population, and there is growing atomic families. Then intergenerational housing inequalities, urbanization, and then there is a problem of housing financialization. So that is also a problem. You need a lot of documentation, you need stability in career, etc. So all of them are actually driving the housing crisis. So this includes economic drivers, demographic drivers. Then we have also talked about the climate vulnerability and housing inequality as well. So what are the recommendations in light of the challenges that we have seen at the global level and at the level of India? So as per UN Habitat, what they have mentioned is that first we require a comprehensive affordability strategies. And this is very important because we should be allowing people with lower P by price by earning ratio to ensure that they are able to acquire land or acquire house. So for that, we need to strengthen land governance. We need to expand rental and non-market housing options. We need to streamline regulatory processes. And this will also help in India, because in India, we have seen that most of the land governance is almost somewhat very, there's huge corruption there, right? So maybe this can be streamlined. Secondly, there should be affordable housing finance as well, and especially for the vulnerable and low income groups, including the informal workers, female headed household. So equity should also be the priority here. Then climate resilient housing policies. which should prevent exclusionary outcomes like green gentrification and green grabbing, right? So largely what the three major suggestion is that one should be the comprehensive affordability strategy, and secondly, equity, and thirdly, climate resilience. Now, what is India doing in this regard? First is India has started with Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban PMAY 2.0, which is about housing for all mission. And it supports 1 crore additional eligible beneficiaries in the next 5 years in urban areas. Supreme Court, in its various judgments, especially in the Olga Tellis case versus Bombay Municipal Corporation, has interpreted Article 21 to also encompass right to livelihood, right to housing, etc. And also, there are key best practices, such as in Yerwada project in Pune, implemented strategic infrastructure measures to mitigate environmental crisis. So this can be given as an example to ensure that how can climate risk can be avoided. Then Bhubaneswar Affordable Housing Project, which is a fully structured PPP, that is public-private partnership in India, right? So we have a legal, we have a governmental scheme, then we have Supreme Court directive, and thirdly, we have certain practices at the local level. So these measures we can mention. Next topic is about India-Italy relation. And here our relationship has now enhanced from the strategic partnership to special strategic partnership, which is a huge development with respect to India-Italy relation. And this was undertaken with the recent Prime Minister's official visit to Italy. Okay. And let us take a look into some of the major outcomes, because here in this particular development, in this visit, a host of agreements were signed, including economic cooperation, political outcomes, and then there were also developments with respect to connectivity, also with respect to uh, supply chain resilience, science and technology. So whole lot of initiatives, outcomes were undertaken. So let us take a look into these. So first was with respect to trade and cooperation, where India and Italy have decided to increase their bilateral trade from currently it is 14 billion euros to 20 billion euros by 2029. And this is going to be supported by the recently concluded India-EU Free Trade Agreement. Okay. Then there is also outcome or agreement on defense industrial roadmap. So India and Italy used to have this buyer-seller relationship, and it was largely interrupted after the Augusta Westland crisis, right? So basically because of the corruption charges, this was disrupted. Also, there was this crisis where the Italian Marines were accused of killing some of the fishermen in India. That is why there was a thaw in the relationship, or there was some sort of problems in the relationship. But now they are trying to increase or enhance their defense partnership as well. And the focus here is on co-design, co-development, and co-production of defense partnership. And especially, there is going to be a marine security dialogue to be launched for increased maritime cooperation. In fact, Italy has recognized India as a major Indo-Pacific power. In terms of connectivity, both countries have reaffirmed their commitment to the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, that is IMEC. And Italy's Mediterranean ports are potential European endpoints for IMEC. So basically, Italy can be considered as the gateway to Europe, right? And here it plays a very important role with respect to the success of the IMEC corridor. Next, with respect to critical technologies and innovation, we have announced Innovate India, that is an innovation hub in India to bridge startups and university research in AI, semiconductors, quantum computing, and fintech. So this is again a new dimension of cooperation, which we can mention apart from defense, apart from investment and trade, apart from connectivity. So science and technology has become a new frontier of cooperation. And the next part is the supply chain resilience, which again India has done with Italy. Apart from that, we have also tried to bring soft power in the relation, and this can be done through cultural cooperation. And we have declared 2027 as the year of culture and tourism between India and Italy. MOU for Italy's participation in developing the National Maritime Heritage Complex at Lothal, Gujarat. Other cooperation is with respect to space cooperation, critical minerals, mobility agreement for Indian nurses, and social security agreement, right? So these, you can see that these, the whole range of cooperation is really, really wide. Okay, so this shows that truly we can say that India and Italy are special strategic partners, and definitely there are certain challenges, but this amounts to a huge uh, sort of development. Now let us take a look into what is the significance of India-Italy relation. First is that Italy is India's fourth largest trading partner in EU. You can see here location of Italy, that how it lies in the Mediterranean Sea, and it is the entry point for so much countries like in the France, Switzerland, all these areas. Then bilateral trade reached around $14 billion in 2024-25. And diplomatic significance, Italy is a key partner in India's Europe and Mediterranean outreach, with cooperation expanding across G20, Indo-Pacific, IMEC, and India-EU networks. In terms of diaspora, there is 1.87 lakh Indians who are residing in Italy, and this has strengthened the people-to-people ties. There is one joint action, strategic action plan 2025-2029, which is supposed to deepen cooperation across strategic, economic, technological, and people-centric sectors. So this is the broad areas why India-Italy relations are so important, because we can see here that it is important not just for economic reason, it is also important given the fact that we are cooperating across multilateral organizations as well. Plus, Italy and India share a lot of convergence in the global vision. For example, they stand for rule of law, they stand for resolution of dispute through peaceful means. So all of them, this grand vision is basically supported by India and Italy. At the same time, there are a couple of differences as well with respect to especially the Russia-Ukraine war. So again, there would be some differences definitely in any bilateral relation, but here we can say that India and Italy are poised for greater future. Next topic is a report released by Niti Aayog, that is ease of doing research and development in India. And this topic is very important because it highlights the problem with respect to the research ecosystem in India, and especially because of the fact that the spending in India, that is gross expenditure on research and development, is very less. It is only 0.65% of GDP, while in other countries such as US, it is 3.5%, in China, it is 2.4%, and in Republic of Korea or South Korea, it is as high as 4.5%. So this report examines the challenges that we face in terms of research and development spending and what can be done to address it. So let us take a look into the key challenges. First is they talk about that the funding that is given is inadequate, and more often, and not just that, most of this funding is heavily dependent on public funding. So approximately 65% of the funding that is given for research and development, they come from the government. On the other hand, in other countries, especially in the OECD countries, most of these funding comes from the private sector. Okay, so here most of, like, around 60% of the budget is contributed by the private sector, but in India it is only about 35%. Secondly, we are not able to attract and retain quality human resource, the people who are working on projects, and this is because of delay in the scholarship. So we are not able to provide scholarship on a timely basis, and we are not able to provide incentives for research to translate their patents or publication into products. Because of these measures, we are not able to attract the quality people to work on our R&D projects. And thirdly, there is problem with technology translation and commercialization. Very few R&D institutions like CSIR have independent business division to deal with translational aspect of technology. So basically what it is saying is that just a technology is not enough. We also need to translate that technology into business. We need to monetize that particular thing. And here in India, we have very few organizations like CSIR which has this. Then R&D in state institutions, we have poor R&D funding and infrastructure, along with burden of affiliations which consumes maximum time and energy of faculty, right? So because of this, again, these are these major challenges that is specified by the report. Now, what are the key recommendations? First is obviously we need to start enhancing the gross expenditure on R&D. So presently it is 0.65%, and Niti Aayog says that at least we should spend at least 2% in the next 4 to 5 years. Then we should create a Vigyan Nidhi, a fellowship system to ensure that the scholarship, the fellowship are disbursed in a timely manner, and it should also provide some sort of incentive as well. Then establish state level RDI cluster. Now this will ensure that the states with poor R&D institutions, MSMEs, can be integrated, and this economy of scale can be utilized. And moreover, it will also act as an industry academia linkage. National Institute for Science Policy and Governance, similar to as STEPI or of South Korea and NISTEP of Japan, may be established to bridge policy, implementation, and monitoring gaps. So basically what it says that we should learn from the examples of countries like South Korea and Japan and try to ensure that we do not create artificial boundaries where technology or policy implementation and monitoring are looked into silos, but we should be trying to assimilate all of them together. Fine. So what are the key initiatives for promoting research in India? So we have Research Development and Innovation Scheme, which was launched in 2025. So this provides fund of rupees 1 lakh crore, aims at strengthening R&D. So this is the first one. Second one is Anusandhan National Research Foundation, that is ANRF, established through ANRF Act 2003 to mobilize funds amounting to rupees 50,000 crore during 2023 to 2028. Then national missions driving frontier research. It is for frontier research such as quantum computing, national mission on interdisciplinary cyber physical system, etc. Then One Nation, One Subscription provides access to high quality scholarly journals and publications so that different organizations or institutions do not have to separately subscribe for various scholarly paper, because they are mostly very expensive in nature. Now let's talk about the fifth news, that is US and China recently met in Beijing, the presidents, and they had and they had projected a constructive relationship of strategic stability. Okay, of course, this is part of GS paper 2 IR, and here we need to understand what US is gaining from this summit and what China is gaining from this summit, and what exactly are the priorities of US and what exactly are the priorities of China. So the idea of strategic stability as per US is based on what? It is based on fairness and reciprocity. So US has this always this complaint that China is the beneficiary of the world system or the system of governance that US has created, and China is not handling the global burden as much as US is. And more or less, there is also no non-reciprocity from the side of China. For example, US has provided access to China has been provided access to US market, but the same has not been done by Chinese side. So again, US whole idea is that it should be providing fairness and reciprocity. And for China, the priorities are different. For China, the priorities are the ensuring that keeping competition within proper limits and respecting China's core national interest. Core interest would be Taiwan, ensuring that China should not be interrupted in the South China Sea, etc. So what it says is that even though there has been some sort of constructive relationship of strategic stability has been established, but what exactly it means, it depends. It is ambiguous. For China, it means different thing. For US, it means different things. And a bunch of articles have been written on this, and they have stated that Beijing has appeared to be a slightly more on the gaining ground as compared to US in this particular summit. So now let's take a look into the key highlights of the summit. What exactly are they doing? First thing is that there is going to establish US-China Board of Trade and Investment. So couple of years back, there was tariff wars that was going on, right? And then in retaliation, China also restricted the flow of critical minerals, right? Rare earth minerals, and that led to some sort of panic in the international market, right? Now, in order for this to be avoided, they have decided to establish a board of trade and investment. They will manage the bilateral trade and investment so that the situation of tariff war and situation of supply chain restriction may not arise in the future. Secondly, in terms of Taiwan question, China has mentioned Taiwan as the most important issue in US-China relation, but US had not omitted this mention from its fact sheet. So what exactly has this happened is that China wanted to seek some sort of assurance from US with respect to Taiwan, but US had denied any assurance. So US has played, or US is following a policy of strategic ambivalence, which means that it has not exactly said what US is going to do when China attempts to take Taiwan. So would US would help Taiwan, or would US agree to what China does? So again, this is not very clear from what has happened in the summit. Thirdly, in terms of global security, both sides have reached a consensus on unblocking of Strait of Hormuz. And then framework for bargaining, not clear settlement. So while for the US, the summit produced key results. So for US, the key priorities was aircraft sale, agricultural purchases. So for a very long time, US wanted to use or to access the agricultural market of China, and now it has become successful. Then it has also restored market access for other products. China has described these outcomes to be pending finalization. So again, we are not very sure to what extent the victory claimed by Donald Trump is correct, right? Because this has yet to be finalized. So these are the major outcomes. One is with respect to trade, board of trade and investment. Second is no clarity with respect to Taiwan. Third, there is global security. So both agree that Strait of Hormuz should be opened. And fourth, the uh, whole framework for trade and economy is yet to be finalized. Now, what exactly are the key irritants? So we have discussed that these are the outcomes, but we should also understand that what exactly are the foundational challenges that US and China face from each other. And this was basically described under a concept called as Thucydides trap. So what is Thucydides trap? So Thucydides trap is an idea that when there is a rising power and when there is a declining power, the rising power can only become a dominant power only by displacing the erstwhile superpower. So there is inevitable conflict that is going to happen. So recently, China said that we do not believe in the Thucydides trap, and it can definitely be avoided. But the thing is, the world is believing in the principle of zero-sum game, right? So generally argued that China's gain corresponds to America's loss, and here this is essentially portrayed through China's great game, that is the One Belt, One Road initiative, or Belt and Road initiative, creation of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, etc., is viewed as counter to US hegemony, right? Then there is ideological differences. So the idea of US is based on freedom, it's based on capitalism, it's based on democracy, while the idea of China is different. Idea of China is based on authoritarianism, on the uh, predominance of communist party or communist state. It further forces containment in their approach again, but this is not a major challenge. This used to be a challenge with US and USSR, the erstwhile USSR, but for with China, the ideological difference does not play a major role. Thirdly, there's problem with Russia, right? So Russia's growing closeness with China, especially after the Ukraine invasion, and its policy of strategic pivot eastward, it serve as an irritant. So basically, there is going to be some sort of uh, Russia-China axis that is being developed, and this may prove detrimental for US and its allies, right? So this again is one of the area of irritant between US and China. Now, whole of this approach also plays a view, it has a lot of implication for India's foreign policy as well. So this A stable US-China relationship is good for India. It reduces risk to global growth. The new dynamics of coexistence of competition in calibrated and transactional form requires India to devise a calibrated approach to its policy. So what it says is that while it is good that US and China's relation are now getting stabilized, so in a way what it will do is that it will ensure that the market will react positively to it. It will also ensure some sort of stability in terms of trade. But the challenge would be that China is also getting very much close to Russia. So for India, US provides maritime balancing to China and Russia provides continental balancing to China. So if India doesn't have any allies, it will be creating a lot of problem for India, because India and China has the boundary dispute and other challenges as well. So maybe India needs to calibrate its foreign policy really well, and India needs to depend, and it needs to get its act together. So this is what we can take away from this topic. From this PYQ has come with respect to this question, the US is facing an existential threat in the form of China that is much more challenging than the erstwhile Soviet Union explained. So here you have to explain that China has started or adopted policies like Belt and Road Initiative. China has also started with the economic policies like or the banking or the organizations like BRICS, NDB, etc., which again was something that the USSR was not able to conceptualize, because more or less the USSR was trying to compete with US in scientific manner or in terms of containment strategy, etc. So here you can do this comparison. Now let's talk about the place in news, where we have South Korea as the place. And this was in news because recently our defense minister visited South Korea in order to deepen the ties with South Korea. Now let us take a look into the political and geographical features of South Korea. So as you can see here, that South Korea is an East Asian country. It is not a Southeast Asian country. So it is not part of ASEAN. It is an East Asian country. Okay. And it is on the southern part of the Korean peninsula, and it is divided by North Korea through this line called 38th parallel, right? So this line is 38° north latitude. It broadly separates South Korea with North Korea. And what about the maritime boundaries? Sea of Japan is in the east, then it has Yellow Sea and in the west, and East China Sea towards the south. Now with respect to the geographical features, this Korea Strait separates South Korea from Japan's Tsushima Islands. And the highest peak is Halasan on Jeju Island. Major rivers of South Korea include Han, Jeum, and Nakdong rivers. Fine, let's now talk about the quick updates. The first news is about shortest period stellar binary system. Now this is a very technical news. Here you just need to know a couple of concepts about the blue straggler stars and brown dwarfs. So what is the news about? That researchers recently have discovered one of the shortest period stellar binary system. And it features a blue straggler star paired with a rare brown dwarf companion in ultra compact orbit. Now what are blue straggler stars? They appear brighter and bluer than the other stars of similar age in star cluster, and they defy standard models of stellar evolution. So blue straggler stars are brighter and bluer than other stars. Second, brown dwarfs. They are celestial objects too massive to be planets but too small to sustain nuclear fusion like stars. So basically brown dwarfs are a transition between planet and stars. Now what exactly is about binary system? It lies within a brown dwarf desert, a region where such companions are considered extremely rare. The orbital period is about 5.6 hours, which is very slow, which very less, and the mass of companion is nearly 0.05 times of Sun, placing it below hydrogen burning limit. So you just need to know these particular concepts. Second, Bhagirathi eco-sensitive zone. So Union government has informed the Supreme Court that it is not in favor of permitting any other new hydroelectric project in Alaknanda and Bhagirathi river basin. Okay, so this has been done because there have been several reports that government may be using this to push for certain developmental projects, but union government has rejected this particular news. So what exactly is Bhagirathi Eco-Sensitive Zone, or ESZ? It was notified in 2012. It covers around 4180 square kilometer area from Gomukh to Uttarakashi. It mandates Uttarakhand government to prepare zonal master plan based on watershed approach. And what are ESZ? ESZ serve as shock absorber for specialized ecosystems such as protected areas or other natural sites. So they are basically like canaries in coal mines. So you understand, if some sort of, so there's some sensitive zones, so if they get impacted, it means that a larger biological or ecological problem is underway. So it is very important that we make sure that these shock absorbers are not interfered with. Then Arunachal organic kiwi. So recently, Union Minister for Development of the Northeastern Region and Communications have launched Mission on Arunachal Kiwi, the USP of Arunachal Pradesh. So this is like mission, like just in UP you have the ODP, one district, one product scheme. So in Northeast, there is a scheme called Brand Northeast, where every state has one USP, unique selling product. So for example, Sikkim has organic state, for Mizoram it is ginger, for Tripura it is queen pineapple, for Nagaland it is coffee, for Meghalaya it is Lakadong turmeric, right? So what about Arunachal organic kiwi? It is a major cash crop of Arunachal Pradesh. Its favorable condition is temperate climate, well-drained defined seasons, fertilized soil enrichment with organic matter, which is found abundantly in Arunachal Pradesh. Organic certification, Arunachal Pradesh has become India's first state to receive organic certification for kiwi cultivation in 2020 under the Mission Organic Value Chain Development for Northeastern Region, right? So this has become the first state. Next, alphinic or kink waves. So new study has shown that, and it has explained why the corona region in sun is substantially higher temperature compared to the surface temperature, because generally it was assumed that the corona would be slightly, or would be lesser temperature, would be of lesser heat. But this research shows why this happens. So what is solar corona? It is the outermost layer of the sun's atmosphere extending millions of kilometers above the surface to the space. So you can consider them to be like its atmosphere. Temperature paradox. Corona temperature reaches about 1 million degrees Celsius, much hotter than the sun's surface or photosphere, that is 5,500 degrees Celsius. So a lot of time the researchers were not able to identify what could be the reason, because generally it was assumed that the surface would be much higher or much warmer compared to the corona. So this is determined by the alphinic or kink waves. So what exactly they are? They are transverse magneto-hydrodynamic waves that travel along the magnetic lines in the sun's corona, causing sideways oscillation of coronal plasma structure. And because of this sideways movement, it generates a lot of heat, and that is why corona becomes warmer. They play a crucial role in the understanding of the coronal heating. Next topic is exercise Pragati 2026. So just understand that this is an exercise that is conducted by some of the countries in Indian Ocean. Okay, so it's a joint military exercise, multinational military exercise held by Indian Army at Umroi Military Station, Meghalaya. And 12 nations are participating this time, including Bhutan, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Philippines, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. Maybe what you can do is you can think, okay, which are the South Asian countries that are participating? What are the countries from Southeast Asia which are participating, right? This will give you an idea. Dollar rupee swap. So recently RBI has announced a $5 billion dollar rupee swap for a tenure of 3 years to inject liquidity. We all know the kind of fall that rupee is seeing in terms of its exchange rate, and that is why this is one of the moves undertaken by RBI. So swap is in the nature of simple buy-sell foreign exchange swap from the RBI side. A bank shall sell US dollars to the RBI and simultaneously agree to buy the same amount of US dollars at the end of the swap period. So the swap period, this can happen. About dollar rupee swap, Forex liquidity management tool. It's a Forex liquidity management tool in which RBI exchanges US dollars and Indian rupees with an agreement to reverse the transaction at a future date. So this essentially, it's a swap period, this is done. Purpose is to manage rupee liquidity, stability forex reserve markets, and reduce exchange rate volatility. International Booker Prize was given to Yang Xuangzi, a Taiwanese writer and author of a book called Taiwan Travelogue. And even the translator have received the Booker Prize, that is Lin King, for 2026. Now, what is International Booker Prize? It is awarded annually for a single book translated into English. So it is not originally in English, it is translated into English. In fact, from India as well, 2 books have recently got the Man Booker Prize or International Booker Prize. The Gitanjali Shri of Tomb of Sand, and then Banu Mushtaq for Hurt Lamb, right? So it was established in 2005 as the Man Booker International Prize, and International Booker Prize is different from Booker Prize, which awards work written in English. So in India, we have several people who have received this Booker Prize as well. For example, Arunti Roy for God of Small Things, and also Salman Rushdie got it for Satanic Verses. Arvind Adiga got this for another book. I think it was for White Tiger, right? So this again is very important. FAO's Agricola Medal. So this medal has been given to India's Prime Minister with its prestigious symbolism. So FAO's Agricola Medal is the organization's highest honor awarded to extraordinary leaders. So it is only awarded to the leaders, okay, leaders of a country, to their commitment and contribution towards the mission of FAO for eradicating hunger, reducing poverty, and ensuring global food security and nutrition. So India has undertaken several measures that provides for subsidized food to the people, and that is why perhaps because of this reason, PM Modi has received this honor. What about FAO? It was formed in 1945. It is a specialized agency of UN, and the purpose is to lead international efforts to defeat hunger. Headquarter is based in Rome, Italy, and it has 193 member states as members, and 1 member organization and 2 associate members. The flagship reports that it publishes are State of Food and Agriculture, the State of the World's Forests, etc. So this is all about news today, and I hope this was useful to you. Make sure that you also attempt the question. Thank you and all the best.